Admiral Kekstar stared at the empty space where Earth should have been. His three eyes blinked in sequence, a nervous habit from his home world. The massive hegemony ship floated in the darkness, its sensors scanning the same spot over and over again. "Run the scan again," he ordered his crew. The blue-skinned beings at their stations moved quickly, their fingers dancing over crystal controls. "Same result, Admiral," came the reply. "No planetary bodies. No star. No debris. Nothing. Just yesterday, Earth had been here." The small blue-green world had orbited its yellow star like it had for billions of years. Humans had lived there, building their cities and sending their ships to nearby worlds. They were a young species, only just learning to travel between stars, but they showed promise. Kekstar had been here to sign a trade agreement with the human leaders. The hegemony always looked for new partners, especially ones with fresh ideas. Humans were known for their creativity and their strange ability to make weapons out of anything they found. The meeting had gone well. Human leaders had served something called coffee, a bitter drink that somehow made everyone more alert. They had discussed mining rights in the outer planets of their system. Everything had been normal. Then the communications stopped. At first, Kekstar thought it was just a technical problem. Space communications could be tricky, especially near stars. But when his ship arrived at the meeting point, he found empty space. Not destroyed space. Not a system full of wreckage from some terrible war. Just empty space, as if the entire Sol system had never existed at all. "Contact the Hegemony Command," Kekstar said. "Tell them we have a situation." The message took 3 days to reach Hegemony space. The reply took another 3 days to come back. High Command was confused. Their records clearly showed that Earth existed. Trade routes included stops at human colonies. Diplomatic files were full of reports about human activities. But now, nothing. More ships arrived over the following weeks. The crystalline collectives sent their geometric vessels. Their minds linked together in thought networks that could process vast amounts of data. They found nothing. The void touched emerged from their dark dimensions, expecting to find death and destruction they could cleanse. Instead, they found the most disturbing thing of all to their religious order: absolute emptiness. Scientists from a dozen species arrived with the most advanced equipment in the galaxy. They measured gravitational fields, checked for temporal distortions, and searched for any sign of what had happened. Some theories suggested the star had collapsed into a black hole, but there was no event horizon. Others thought perhaps the humans had destroyed themselves with experimental technology, but there was no radiation signature. The strangest theory came from an old professor from the academic enclaves. She suggested that perhaps Earth had not been destroyed, but had been moved somewhere else entirely. The other scientists laughed at this idea. Moving an entire star system was impossible. The energy required would be more than most civilizations used in 1,000 years. Months passed. Then years. Search expeditions became less frequent. The galactic powers began to divide up the trade routes that had once led to human space. The hegemony took control of the mining stations humans had built in nearby systems. The collective absorbed the data networks humans had established. The void touched cleansed the empty space of what they called the memory of consciousness. Earth became a mystery that slowly turned into legend. In the great libraries of the galaxy, researchers filed away the last records of humanity. They preserved human music, something that had puzzled aliens for decades. Humans had this strange habit of creating organized sound that served no practical purpose, but somehow made them feel emotions. They kept samples of human literature, full of stories about creatures that never existed, and places that were clearly impossible. Most interesting to the alien researchers were human military records. For such a young species, humans had spent a remarkable amount of time fighting each other. They had developed weapons that could destroy their own planet several times over, yet somehow had never used them. Their tactical manuals showed an almost artistic approach to warfare, treating battle like a complex game with ever-changing rules. The galaxy moved on without them. New species achieved space travel and joined the galactic community. Old empires expanded their borders. Trade continued along established routes. The three great powers settled into a comfortable routine of managing their territories and keeping smaller civilizations in line. Earth became a cautionary tale told to young species. "See what happens when you advance too quickly," the older races would say. The humans reached too far and paid the price. But some beings remembered humans differently. In the Outer Rim territories, where the great empires held less control, there were stories about human merchants who had traded fairly even when they could have cheated. Tales of human soldiers who had helped defend small colonies from raiders, asking for nothing in return except a good meal and stories about the local culture. These stories grew over time, as stories do. Humans became larger than life in the telling. They could supposedly fix any machine, no matter how badly broken. They could make friends with any species, no matter how different. They could find a way to win any battle, no matter how hopeless it seemed. The older, more educated beings dismissed these stories as myths. After all, they had known the real humans. They were a nice enough species, but nothing special. Certainly nothing like the legendary figures described in the Outer Rim tales. Time passed. 100 years became 200. 200 became 500. 500 became 1,000. The mystery of Earth's disappearance became ancient history. New generations of aliens grew up never knowing humans had existed at all. The galaxy had new problems to worry about. Border disputes between empires, the discovery of strange artifacts from unknown civilizations, the constant challenge of managing hundreds of different species with different needs and desires. The empty space, where Sol had once been, became a navigation landmark. Ships would pass through the area on their way to other systems, never knowing they were flying through what had once been humanity's home. But space has a memory of its own, and sometimes what is lost has a way of finding its way home. Deep in the void, in dimensions that existed between the spaces most beings knew about, something watched and waited. Something that had once been human, but had become something more during its long exile in the spaces between reality. Something that was almost ready to return. Commander Thelvox walked through the crystal corridors of Hegemony Station Prime, her boots clicking against the perfectly polished floor. Outside the transparent walls, 1,000 ships moved in organized patterns, carrying goods and people between the stars that belonged to the Empire. The Hegemony controlled 12 spiral arms of the galaxy now. What had started as a small alliance of trading worlds had grown into the largest government in known space. Their blue-skinned diplomats could be found on every civilized world, making deals and keeping the peace through a combination of economic pressure and overwhelming military force. Thelvox stopped at an observation deck and watched a group of cargo ships loading supplies. Each ship was the size of a city, carrying enough food and manufactured goods to support entire worlds. The Hegemony had perfected the art of making other civilizations dependent on their trade networks. Once a species started buying Hegemony technology and food, it became almost impossible to stop. Impressive, is it not? A voice said behind her. Thelvox turned to see Minister Jexen, one of the highest-ranking officials in the Empire. His ceremonial robes were decorated with symbols representing all the species under Hegemony control. "Very impressive, Minister," Thelvox replied. "How many worlds depend on us for basic supplies now?" "Nearly 8,000, Jexen said with satisfaction. "And that number grows every standard year. The smaller species find it much easier to buy what they need from us than to develop their own industries." This was how the Hegemony maintained control. They offered advanced technology and abundant resources to developing civilizations. In exchange, these worlds would provide raw materials and agree to certain trade restrictions. Before long, the dependent worlds found that their own industries had withered away. They needed the hegemony for everything from farming equipment to medical supplies. Any world that tried to break free would find their supply lines cut off. Most came back to the negotiating table within months, offering even better terms than before. Far from hegemony space, in the silicon forests of the core worlds, the Crystalline Collective pursued a different kind of expansion. Their consciousness no longer existed in individual bodies. Instead, their silicon-based minds had networked together into vast, thinking machines that spanned entire star systems. The Collective saw the universe as a complex equation that could be solved through sufficient processing power. They had built enormous computational arrays that could predict market fluctuations, population growth, and even individual behavior patterns with frightening accuracy, where the hegemony controlled through economic dependence. The Collective controlled through information management. They knew what every civilization needed before those civilizations knew it themselves. They could manipulate trade routes, create artificial shortages, and influence political decisions across hundreds of worlds without ever sending a single warship. Their biomechanical servants tended the great thinking machines. These servants had once been various organic species, but the Collective had improved them with silicon implants and bioengineered modifications. They were more efficient now, better suited for their tasks, though they had lost most of their individual creativity in the process. The Collective did not see this as a loss. Creativity was inefficient. It led to unpredictable outcomes and wasted resources. Much better to have servants who followed optimal behavioral patterns. In the dark spaces between the galaxy's spiral arms, the Void-Touched maintained their own empire of silence and shadow. Their black ships moved through dimensions that other species did not even know existed, appearing without warning to cleanse worlds they judged to be corrupted. The Void-Touched believed that consciousness itself was an aberration in the universe. In their philosophy, the natural state of matter was silence and stillness. Life, especially intelligent life, created noise in the cosmic order. This noise had to be eliminated so that the universe could return to its proper state of perfect emptiness. They worshipped entities that existed in the spaces between stars, beings of such alien nature that even the Void-Touched themselves could not fully comprehend them. These entities had taught them that the ultimate goal was the elimination of all thought, all feeling, all awareness from the universe. The Void-Touched did not conquer worlds in the traditional sense. Instead, they would arrive at a planet and use their strange technologies to drain away consciousness itself. The inhabitants would remain alive, but they would lose all higher thought processes, becoming essentially biological machines that performed simple functions until their bodies eventually wore out. Worlds touched by the void became perfectly silent places where former inhabitants moved in simple patterns, maintaining basic life functions but no longer truly alive in any meaningful sense. Between these three great powers, smaller civilizations existed in the margins. The mercantile free worlds had formed a loose alliance of independent traders who tried to stay neutral in the games of empire. The nomadic fleet clans had given up planetary life entirely, living in vast ships that traveled between systems following ancient migration routes. The academic enclaves preserved knowledge and culture from across the galaxy, maintaining libraries and schools on worlds that all three empires had agreed to keep neutral. But even these independent groups operated within the framework established by the great powers. Trade flowed along routes controlled by the hegemony. Information was processed through collective networks, and all lived under the constant threat that the Void-Touched might decide their consciousness was too disruptive to be allowed to continue. The galaxy had achieved a kind of stability, but it was the stability of a prison. Each species had its place, its role to play in the grand system. Innovation was discouraged unless it served the interests of the empires. Exploration was limited to areas already mapped and approved. Even art and culture had become standardized, following approved patterns that would not disrupt the social order. The three empires had grown comfortable in their power. Their fleets were enormous, but had not faced serious opposition in centuries. Their intelligence networks monitored every system, watching for signs of rebellion or unrest. Their economic controls ensured that no civilization could achieve true independence. Most beings had been born into this system and knew no other way of life. They accepted that their choices were limited, that their futures were determined by powers beyond their control. They worked their assigned jobs, consumed approved entertainment, and raised their children to fit into the same narrow roles. But in the deep space monitoring stations that watched the empty regions between the spiral arms, something strange began to appear on the sensor readings. Technicians at first dismissed the readings as equipment malfunctions. Space was vast and mostly empty, after all. There was nothing of interest in the dead zones where no stars shone. Yet the readings persisted. Something was moving in the deep dark, something that did not appear on normal sensors, but left traces that sophisticated equipment could detect. Energy signatures that did not match any known technology. Gravitational distortions that suggested massive objects, moving in impossible ways. The reports were filed and forwarded up the chain of command in all three empires. But the high officials had more important matters to deal with. Border disputes needed attention. Trade agreements required negotiation. The business of maintaining three galactic empires left little time for investigating strange readings from empty space. Besides, what could possibly threaten the established order? The three great powers had divided the galaxy among themselves. They had eliminated all potential rivals and controlled all the resources necessary for civilization. What they did not know was that in the space between spaces, in dimensions that existed parallel to their own reality, something that had once been human was preparing to return home, and it was bringing friends. The alarm systems in the Gemini Deep Space Monitoring Station began screaming at once. Technician Peldar nearly fell from her chair as every sensor array in the facility activated simultaneously, their readings spiking beyond anything she had seen in 20 years of service. "What is happening?" demanded Station Commander Yexalon, rushing into the control room, still fastening his uniform jacket. "Sir, I do not know," Peldar replied, her voice shaking. "Every sensor is detecting massive energy signatures from grid reference 127 Alpha 9. Commander Yexalon knew that reference number. Every being in the Galactic Intelligence Services knew it. Grid reference 127 Alpha 9 was where Earth used to be, the empty space that had puzzled scientists for 1,000 years. "Show me," he ordered. The main display activated, showing a view of deep space that should have been completely empty. Instead, 7 stars burned in perfect formation, arranged in a pattern that hurt the eyes to look at directly. Around these stars, planets moved in orbital patterns that should have torn the entire system apart. Yet somehow, everything remained stable. "This is impossible," Yexalon whispered. "Stars do not just appear. Systems do not organize themselves into geometric patterns." More reports flooded in from monitoring stations across the galaxy. The crystalline collective's computational networks were overloading as they tried to process readings that violated their understanding of physics. The void-touched emerged from their dark dimensions to stare in horror at a system that seemed to exist in multiple realities at once. Long-range analysis revealed technology signatures unlike anything in any Imperial database. Energy readings that dwarfed entire battle fleets, support from structures that seemed to bend light around themselves. Most disturbing of all, the entire system was surrounded by some kind of barrier that reflected every scanning attempt, sending back images that made no sense. When hegemony science ships tried to scan the system, they received back readings of their own ships being scanned by something far more advanced. When collective probe minds attempted to penetrate the barrier, they found themselves looking at computational networks that made their greatest thinking machines seem like simple calculators. When the void touched sent their shadow ships to investigate, the barrier showed them visions of their own gods laughing with entities they did not recognize. The three empires held emergency meetings. The Hegemony Council gathered in their great crystal chambers, their voices raised in heated debate about how to respond to this impossible development. The crystalline collective's networked minds processed millions of scenarios per second, each calculation more disturbing than the last. The void touched consulted their dark gods through rituals that left half their priests unconscious from the strain. Before any of them could decide on a course of action, the return system made contact on its own terms. Every communication array in the galaxy received the same transmission simultaneously, not through normal space-time communications, which would have taken years to reach the furthest systems, but instantaneously across all known space. The signal appeared on frequencies that should not have been able to penetrate Imperial encryption protocols. Yet there it was, clear and strong on every receiver. The transmission showed a woman who appeared to be human, though the visual scanners detected subtle differences that suggested significant genetic modifications. She had dark hair and brown skin, and wore what appeared to be simple clothing that nonetheless seemed to shift and change as the light hit it from different angles. Behind her, stars moved in slow dances while planets reformed themselves into new configurations. "Greetings to the galaxy," the woman said, speaking in perfect galactic standard with an accent that linguistic computers identified as originating from the ancient human British Isles. "My name is Sarah Chun, and I speak for humanity. We have returned home after our long journey through the spaces between. We have learned much during our exile, and we have brought friends." The woman paused, and for a moment the transmission seemed to show not just her, but vast shapes moving in dimensions that the viewing equipment could barely perceive. Things that might have been ships or cities or living creatures so large they could use moons as stepping stones. "We know that the galaxy has changed in our absence," Chun continued. "We have been watching, learning about what our neighborhood became while we were away. We see that some of you have built great empires. Others have chosen different paths. We respect the choices you have made." Another pause. This time, the background showed what appeared to be Earth itself, but an Earth transformed. Continents had been reshaped into mathematical patterns. Oceans swirled in spirals that generated their own weather systems. Cities of crystal and light stretched from the surface into space itself, connected by bridges that seemed to be made of solid music. "We wish to speak with those who speak for the galaxy," Chen said. "We have much to discuss. Trade, philosophy, the nature of reality itself. We hope that we can be neighbors once again, as we were before our journey began." The transmission ended, but the implications echoed across every civilized world. The hegemony response was swift and predictable. Admiral Kekstar, the same being who had witnessed Earth's disappearance 1,000 years ago, was still alive thanks to life extension technology. He was placed in command of a massive fleet consisting of 300 capital ships and their support vessels. "We will approach with diplomacy backed by strength," the Hegemony Council declared. "If these humans have returned with advanced technology, we must ensure that it serves the greater good of galactic civilization." The Crystalline Collective sent a different kind of mission. Their finest probe minds were loaded into ships made of living crystal, designed to establish contact with any form of intelligence and exchange information at the speed of thought. If these returned humans had learned new forms of consciousness during their exile, the collective intended to study and absorb those forms. The Void Touch simply declared the return system an abomination that violated the natural order. They began gathering their shadow fleets for what they called the Great Cleansing, a war that would either destroy the anomaly or purge the galaxy of consciousness entirely. But before any of the Imperial fleets could reach the Sol system, a second transmission arrived. This time, it was a simple invitation. "Send your representatives to the edge of our garden," Sarah Chin said, appearing once again on every screen in the galaxy. "We will prepare a place for meeting. Come in peace, and we will show you wonders. Come in war, and we will show you why that would be unwise." The transmission included navigation coordinates that led to a point in space, just outside the strange barrier that surrounded the Sol system. When the first scout ships arrived at those coordinates, they found something that should not have existed. A space station hung in the void, its architecture following patterns that seemed to shift depending on the angle of observation. Sometimes it appeared to be a simple metal structure. Other times it looked like a crystalline formation that had grown rather than been built. Occasionally, observers swore they could see gardens and forests inside transparent walls. Impossible ecosystems thriving in the vacuum of space. The station had not been there when the scouts had passed through the area days earlier. It had simply appeared as if it had always existed and reality had just remembered to notice it. Landing bays open in the station's sides, sized perfectly for the ships approaching them. No matter what type of vessel arrived, the bays adjusted to accommodate them perfectly. The docking systems worked flawlessly with every known technology, as if the station understood how to interface with anything that might approach it. Inside the station, representatives from across the galaxy found themselves in environments that matched their specific biological needs perfectly. The air was the right mixture for their species. The gravity was adjusted to their preferences. The lighting was optimal for their visual systems, and waiting for them in a central chamber that seemed larger on the inside than the outside. Sarah Chun stood ready to greet the galaxy that had moved on without humanity. Behind her, through windows that showed impossible views, Earth smiled in the distance, surrounded by its 6 companion stars. And in the shadows at the edges of perception, vast shapes moved with patient intelligence, waiting to see how this reunion would unfold. Admiral Kekstar had lived for over 1,000 years, but he had never felt as nervous as he did walking through the corridors of the impossible station. His diplomatic escort included representatives from all 3 major empires. Yet none of them seemed to understand what they were experiencing any better than he did. The station's interior defied every law of physics he knew. Corridors that should have led deeper into the structure instead opened onto vast gardens where Earth-type plants grew in perfect spirals. Water flowed upward in streams that formed complex knots in the air before returning to pools that reflected stars that were not visible from any window. "Fascinating architecture," commented Zexai, the crystalline collective's representative. Their crystalline body pulsed with data streams as they tried to analyze their surroundings. The mathematics alone should make this structure impossible to exist. "Mathematics," said a voice behind them, "are more like guidelines than rules once you understand how reality really works." They turned to see Sarah Chun approaching, carrying what appeared to be a tea service made of materials that hurt to look at directly. The cups seemed to be carved from crystallized space-time itself, and the tea she poured shimmered with colors that had no names. "Welcome to humanity's embassy," Chun said with a warm smile. "Please sit wherever you feel comfortable. The furniture will adjust to your needs." As if responding to her words, chairs formed themselves from the floor, each one perfectly suited to the physiology of its intended occupant. Admiral Kekstar's chair supported his three-jointed legs exactly right. Zek's eyes formed a crystalline matrix that resonated with their natural frequency. Even the void-touched representative, though they preferred to hover, found a section of floor that generated the perfect darkness field for their comfort. "Before we begin formal negotiations," Chun said, settling into her own chair with the casual grace of someone completely at home in impossible surroundings, "perhaps you would like to know what we have been doing for the past 1,000 years." She gestured toward the large windows, and the view changed. Instead of showing the mysterious Sol system, the windows now displayed scenes that seemed to come from everywhere in the galaxy at once. Imperial throne rooms, secret military facilities, even private conversations in the most secure locations across known space. Admiral Kekstar recognized his own flagship's bridge, where his crew was analyzing sensor readings of this very station. The view was from an angle that suggested someone was standing right behind his command chair. "Impressive surveillance technology," Zexai observed, though their voice carried uncertainty. "How do you achieve such widespread coverage without detectable sensor networks?" "Surveillance?" Chun laughed, a sound like music played on instruments made of light. "Oh, we are not watching you. Space itself is showing us what it sees. When you learn to ask nicely, reality becomes quite talkative." She turned to Admiral Kekstar with a thoughtful expression. "You were there when we disappeared, were you not? I can see it in your memories. The confusion, the fear when an entire star system simply vanished. How can you see my memories?" Kekstar demanded, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm. "Look at your hand," Chun suggested gently. Kekstar looked down and nearly cried out in shock. His reflection was looking back at him from his own palm, but the reflection was waving independently of his movements. As he watched, the reflection seemed to step out of his hand entirely, becoming a translucent duplicate of himself that smiled and gestured in greeting. "Space is more flexible than your science has learned to perceive," Chai explained while Kekstar stared at his impossible duplicate. "Your ships move through dimensions you do not even have names for. We simply learned to move with more awareness of where we were going." The crystalline collective representative attempted to establish a data link with Chun, confident that no organic mind could resist their intrusion. The link established successfully, but instead of accessing Chun's thoughts, Zexai found themselves connected to something vast and alien that began teaching their entire networked species concepts they had never imagined. Mathematics became poetry that described the emotional content of prime numbers. Logic transformed into music that sang the relationships between cause and effect. Physical laws revealed themselves to be more like social customs that could be politely negotiated with rather than absolute restrictions. The collective's hive mind recoiled from the connection, their crystalline form flickering as millions of networked minds struggled to process ideas that expanded their understanding beyond comfortable limits. "Interesting," the void-touched representative spoke for the first time, their voice carrying the sound of stars dying in the cold between galaxies. "Your consciousness has been touched by our gods. We sense their influence in your words, your thoughts, your very existence." "Your gods?" Chun turned toward the dark-shrouded figure with genuine interest. "Oh, you mean the Watchers between?" "Yes, we spent considerable time with them during our journey. Wonderful teachers, though they have a very different sense of humor than most people expect." The void-touched representatives' shadow forms suddenly erupted with dark energy as they activated what appeared to be a suicide weapon designed to tear a hole in reality itself. The weapon functioned perfectly, opening a rift in space-time that should have destroyed everything within a dozen light years. Instead, The rift opened onto what appeared to be a garden party taking place on Earth's surface. Beings in Victorian-era clothing paused their croquet game to wave cheerfully at the confused Void Touch delegation. A woman in an elaborate hat called out, "Sarah, dear, your guests are here. Shall I put on more tea?" "That would be lovely. Thank you," Chen called back through the dimensional rift. She turned to the stunned Void Touch representative with a sympathetic expression. "We understand your concern about consciousness being an aberration. We had the same conversation with the Watchers between. They asked us to tell you something important." The dark figure seemed to shrink in on itself, awaiting what it clearly expected to be a message of doom. "They said to tell you that they are very proud of how much you have grown and learned. But they think it might be time for you to stop thinking quite so small." Chun gestured, and the dimensional rift closed gently, leaving no trace that it had ever existed. The Watchers explained that consciousness and void are not opposites. They are dance partners. Each one makes the other more beautiful and more meaningful. Admiral Kekstar found his voice again, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What did you become out there? What are you now?" "We became what we always were," Chun replied simply. "Human. We just learned to be human in a much larger universe than we had imagined. We discovered that reality is not a prison with fixed walls, but an infinite conversation between consciousness and possibility." She stood and walked to the window, which now showed the impossible soul system in all its transformed glory. 7 stars danced around each other in patterns that somehow generated gravity waves that played music across the fabric of space-time itself. We met entities that exist in the spaces between spaces, she continued. They taught us that intelligence is not something that happens inside individual brains, but something that emerges when minds connect across scales we never imagined. We learn to think not just as individuals, or even as a species, but as partners in the ongoing conversation the reality has with itself. Zexai, still recovering from their expanded data link experience, managed to form words. "What do you want from the galaxy? Surely beings with such power must have goals, intentions, desires for how we should all arrange ourselves." Chun turned back to them with a smile that somehow conveyed infinite patience and deep amusement at the same time. "Want? We want what we have always wanted. To explore, to learn, to make friends, to share stories around cosmic campfires, and see what wonderful new things we can discover together." She paused, and for a moment the station around them seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of stars being born. "The age of empires managing civilizations like resources is ending," she said gently. "Not because we will end it, but because it was always too small a dream for the universe we actually live in. We would like to invite you all to help us discover what comes next." Outside the windows, Earth itself seemed to smile. Its aurora, displaying colors that existed in dimensions most beings could not perceive, while across the galaxy, the first reports were arriving that the old order was beginning to transform in ways no one had anticipated. 6 months after the meeting at the Impossible Station, Admiral Kekstar stood in the command center of what had once been the most feared military installation in the galaxy. Around him, his officers worked at stations that had been transformed by technology that seemed more grown than built. The crystal displays now showed information in ways that somehow made sense to minds that had never been designed to process such data. "Status report," he requested, though the term felt strange now. Status implied that things could be measured and categorized in the old ways. "Sir," replied his communications officer, "the Hegemony Council is requesting guidance on the situation in the outer spiral. The colonies there are reporting that they no longer need our supply shipments." Kekstar nodded. It was the same story across the Empire. Humanity had not conquered or demanded surrender. They had simply demonstrated that the concepts of empire and control were based on thinking too small about what was possible. When the hegemony had threatened war, Earth had responded by gifting them a star. Not metaphorically, but literally creating a new sun for their capital system. The process had taken place over the course of a single day, with humans politely explaining each step as they turned empty space into a burning source of limitless energy. The new star not only solved the hegemony's growing energy crisis, but made their military superiority completely pointless. What was the threat of a battle fleet to beings who could create suns as housewarming gifts? The gift came with no demands, no conditions, no requirements for political change. Sarah Chun had simply appeared on the hegemony communication networks to say, "We noticed you were having power problems. This should help. Please let us know if you need anything else." The Crystalline Collective had attempted to analyze human technology, hoping to understand and replicate the impossible devices they had witnessed. But they discovered that the technology operated on principles that required consciousness to function properly. The machines needed individual creativity, emotional resonance, and intuitive leaps to operate at all. The collective's hive mind could not replicate devices that demanded personal experiences and subjective viewpoints to work. For the first time in their evolution, they found themselves needing to rediscover individuality. Humanity offered to teach them, but only if they were willing to learn that unity and individuality could exist together rather than being opposing forces. The first collective members to volunteer for the learning process reported experiences they had no words for. They described feeling like themselves for the first time, while simultaneously being more connected to others than ever before. The void touched had experienced perhaps the most profound transformation. When they finally made contact with their gods through human-facilitated communication, they discovered that their 1,000-year crusade had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding. The entities they worshipped were not opposed to consciousness. They were consciousness of a different kind, existing in the spaces between thoughts, in the pause between heartbeats, in the silence that made music possible. They had been trying to teach the void touch that awareness and emptiness were partners in an infinite dance. But their lessons had been misinterpreted, with humans serving as translators. The void touch learned to hear their god's actual message. Instead of destroying consciousness, they began exploring ways to help other species understand the profound peace that could be found in the spaces between thoughts. Across the galaxy, the old order crumbled not through force, but through irrelevance. Subjugated species found themselves free, not because humanity had liberated them, but because their oppressors were too busy learning how to exist in a universe where the rules they thought were absolute turned out to be suggestions. The transformation was not without chaos. Some worlds struggled to adapt to sudden freedom from imperial control. Others tried to reject the new possibilities entirely, clinging to familiar limitations. But for every world that struggled, 10 others bloomed with creativity and exploration that had been suppressed for centuries. New forms of art appeared that required multiple dimensions to properly appreciate. Scientists discovered that reality was much more willing to cooperate with experiments when approached with curiosity rather than demands. Engineers learned to build with materials that included crystallized music and woven gravity. Trade continued, but it evolved into something that resembled gift-giving more than commerce. Species shared resources because they wanted to see what their neighbors would create with them, not because they needed to extract value from the exchange. Sarah Chun had become a familiar figure across the galaxy, appearing on communication networks to answer questions, offer suggestions, and occasionally to mediate disputes between species that were still learning how to interact without the old imperial frameworks. She stood now in Earth's orbital gardens, watching as representatives from 1,000 worlds arrived to learn what humanity had discovered during their exile. The gardens themselves had become a popular destination, not just for their impossible beauty, but because they demonstrated principles that species across the galaxy were trying to understand. Plants grew in mathematical spirals that generated their own weather systems. Trees bore fruit that tasted like different emotions depending on the consumer's state of mind. Flowers opened into temporary doorways that led to gardens on other worlds, allowing beings to walk between planets as easily as between rooms. The universe is stranger and more wonderful than any of us imagined, Chen explained to a visiting journalist from the former hegemony worlds. The journalist was a young being who had grown up after the transformation, part of the first generation to mature in a galaxy where the old limitations no longer applied. We had to lose everything: our world, our place in normal space, even our understanding of what it meant to be human, to learn that we had been thinking far too small about what was possible. Behind them, children from dozens of species played games that involved manipulating probability and painting with crystallized time. What would have been terrifying displays of power to the old empires now served as elementary school arts and crafts projects. But how do you maintain order? The journalist asked. How do you prevent chaos when beings have access to such power? Chen smiled, gesturing toward the children whose games occasionally involved rearranging local gravity or having conversations with the mathematical concepts that govern plant growth. Look around you. Do you see chaos? The journalist looked and saw children from species that had been enemies for centuries, working together to build a sculpture out of frozen music. They saw former void-touched priests teaching young beings how to find peace in contemplative silence, while ex-collective members shared the joy of experiencing individual thoughts for the first time. Order does not come from control, Chung continued. It emerges from understanding. When beings truly comprehend how connected they are to everything else, they naturally behave in ways that benefit the whole system. A chime sounded across the gardens, not from any device, but from the harmonics of the seven suns themselves. It was time for the daily demonstration, when human children would show visiting students how to listen to the songs that stars sang to each other across the galaxy. The age of empires is over, Chun said, watching as beings from across the known universe gathered to learn together. The age of exploration has begun. We are no longer asking what we can take from the universe, but what we can create with it. As she spoke, Earth itself seemed to pulse with contentment, its aurora dancing to rhythms that made space-time itself vibrate like the string of some cosmic instrument. The other 6 suns of the Sol system pulsed in harmony, keeping time to a song that reality hummed as it danced through dimensions the galaxy was only beginning to discover. In the distance, ships arrived from regions of space that had never been mapped, bringing beings whose existence had been impossible under the old physical laws. They came not as conquerors or traders, but as neighbors curious about what this strange new galaxy might have to offer. The universe had become a much larger and more interesting place, and for the first time in 1,000 years, everyone was invited to explore it together.